A lot more kind of screaming at the ocean at Jesus is probably where a lot of my grief has come from. But did you know that most feelings only last 5 minutes, according to one researcher? According to another researcher, a feeling only lasts 90 seconds on average. And so I started thinking about this, like, if when I was holding my great niece, a newborn baby, and I'm holding her, and I had just learned this information, and sure enough, after about a minute, minute and a half, I looked back up at the clock, and that's when my feelings kind of, oh, I'm holding this little one, kind of started, that love, for lack of better words, kind of just started to dissipate, and it became normal. And I thought, this is really fascinating to me. But then I was listening to a researcher that also said, but there is one. There is one feeling that doesn't last the 90 seconds or the 5 minutes, whichever research we follow, and that is the feeling of grief. And there's a lot of different ideas on grief and how long it lasts, what you go through, and today I'm going to share some of my own ideas. Now, do I wish I would have read the book that you go over with the nuggets on the third Sunday? You bet I did. But the one thing that I know God has asked of me is stop, Tammy. I put you here at this moment to do this thing because of who you are. That's great that everybody else has these experiences. Had I had any idea how many books about heaven for children had already been written, I don't know that I would have wrote that book, because who am I? There's a journey here within my grief, within my writing, and what I found that also goes to a worthiness. And it's been an interesting walk as I go through all of these things in my own stages of grief. And then as I support others. And through this walk, I've been wondering, is there more? Is there more here, Lord? This is what the research tells us are the stages. But is there more? I want you to think about where you're at today in grieving. Whether you are grieving a person in heaven instead of being here on earth with you, whether you're grieving the life of a baby that you never got to hold due to loss of via miscarriage, or a dream that you had to have a baby in your arms someday, but infertility has kept you away from that. These are the ways I've dealt with grief over the years. So what stage are you living in right now? Are you in bargaining? Are you in acceptance, denial, anger, depression? Right now, in my stages of grief, we're about to make a life change, a huge life change. And my husband just left his job on Thursday. And at the same time, he's been in the hospital for 2 weeks and now won't be able to work because he just had open heart surgery. Talk about major griefs colliding there, right? Because grief, yes, it is when we lose somebody, but grief is a loss. And no matter what loss we're going through, these tend to be the stages. But I think there's another one there too. But in order to think about that stage of grief, we need to think about where we're at. And are you inviting grief in to your life? Or are you pushing grief out of your life at this time? Here's what I mean by when I say inviting grief in. When I wrote the book Jack's Dreams of Heaven up here, which was the first children's book I wrote, I was inviting the grief into my life. And I wrote the book to help others invite grief into their life. I also have a problem. It's too much positivity. Literally, I tested too high for positivity. And so when I invite grief in, I'm like, oh, I can help everybody. I can be there for you. But the one thing that I didn't have was somebody understanding the loss that I had when my mother-in-law passed away. Because the mother-in-law jokes, right, or you don't get along and things like that. That wasn't my mother-in-law. And so she became the character for Jack's Dreams of Heaven in the book. because I was somewhere between the denial with all my positivity and acceptance that obviously she's not here. It's Easter and we're dying Easter eggs without her. She became this character. And I realized at that time, having her as the main character in Jack's Dreams of Heaven, that went up to heaven that Jax goes to look for, was my way of dealing with grief. Now, it'd be easy to say, oh, yeah, I did this for God. He wanted me to spread hope. He wanted me to do these things. But in reality, God's like, Tammy, you have no idea how bad you deal with grief. So I'm going to have you write this book. And this book you might think is for everybody else, but it's also going to be for you. Because when I wrote it for everybody else, I chose to put my nephew Brandon in the book, hiding behind the tree, playing hide and seek up in heaven with the dogs. He was my nephew who passed away in a car accident at age 20. We had just brought him home from serving over in Afghanistan as a Marine, and one of the traumatic losses in my life. I also put in my Aunt Sharon, the one below the angel, who was playing ball with the dog Lucky up in heaven. But the interesting thing about my Aunt Sharon is I never knew her. She passed away at age 17. So why? Why do I have grief over my Aunt Sharon then? I never met her. She was never a part of my life. But in reality, I slept in her room when I stayed at my grandparents' farm. I played with her doll. I dressed up in her prom dress. Her legacy was so strong in there, my grandparents had not moved a thing in that room. I do think my grandma washed the sheets, though. At least I kind of hope. But it had been at least 10 years. At least 10 years from the time Aunt Sharon had passed away before I was ever old enough to play with a doll in that room. I saw this kind of generational grief when I was visiting a 5th grade classroom. I was just getting ready to launch Mama Where's the Baby, a book explaining miscarriage. And as soon as the kids were kind of talking, asked me, what's your next book, Miss Stuhr? And I said, oh, it's a book on miscarriage. The hands went up. And we went around the room, and 5 of these young people told me that they're a rainbow baby. They're the baby that was born to the family after they had experienced miscarriage. The generational grief. The stories that the parents had to have shared. And each one of them knew, like, how many years it had been, what the other one's name was that came before them. Like, the grief was invited into their families. And I thought, how fascinating. How fascinating that these parents are inviting the most important people into their lives, into their grief. The importance of community. The importance of the story. I also invited grief into my life when I put this page together for Jack's Dreams of Heaven. It's a story of what happened at Heaven's gates. And this is one of them that really made me start thinking about what is this other stage of grief that might be out there that we're not seeing in the research. And it's because my husband and my daughter and I were at the Omaha Zoo, and we knew that my stepsister wasn't doing well. My parents had gone out to Colorado to be with her in those last moments. But I was walking out of the bathroom at the zoo, and all of a sudden I saw this image. And it was like this kind of cloud came in front of me. And Nana, my stepdad's mom, never met her either. I saw her go up to the gates of heaven, and Kim, my stepsister, comes walking in. Kim died as an adult, but she's probably around 8 to 10 years old at this time. She's in a white dress and black patent shoes, and she's walking up to her Nana. And Nana picks her up, and she swings and dances her into the gates of heaven. My phone rings. It's my sister. She goes, hey, I'm just calling to let you know that Kim died. And I go, yeah, I know. I just watched her go to heaven. And so when I was working with my illustrator on this page of the book, she had yellow gates. And I said, no, they have to be gold. She goes, they are. And I go, no, they're yellow. Like, the gates of heaven are truly gold. And she's like, wow, you are so specific, Tammy. I'm like, I know, because I saw the gates of heaven. I watched my stepsister walk through them. That feeling that was created was so powerful. When I left my position at UNL 4 years ago, God asked me to write a book on miscarriage. And I said, no, thank you. It was clear to me, and a very direct answer to God, that nope, not me. And I'm pushing that away. I'm pushing the grief. I'm pushing whatever this is that you're trying to bring into my life, Lord. No, thank you. I didn't realize it at the time how unworthy I felt to write that book, because I was comparing myself to my aunt who delivered a full-term baby, which was very different than me. Like, we just found out, and I was barely after 3 months along, we just started to tell people. Like, and I just felt this unworthiness in being able to write my story in a book about miscarriage and explaining that. But you know what? As I said before, God didn't need me to do this for him. He needed me to do it for me, because of that positivity, because he needed me to understand better how to sit with him in my grief, how to take him into my journey instead of push him out. But you want to know what really finally changed my mind? I was at an authors conference, and we were all sharing, and they said, oh, what's a challenge you have? And I'm like, well, there's this book, where somebody's really sad, and I just don't know how an illustrator would capture the eyes, because the eyes are, that mirror of the feelings that happen. And they're like, well, what's your book on? I'm like, miscarriage. And the lady across the table from me, she goes, you wrote a book on miscarriage? Yeah. Like, feed into my unworthiness, right? It was huge. And I go, why? She goes, I miscarried last month, and my boys asked me to explain to them, and I just said I couldn't. I need your book. Can I have it now? I finally started to have somebody I could serve. Somebody else that was besides me that said, I need your book. I need this, not only for me, but also for my family. That's when I said, all right, God, let's do this. I get it now. Let's get this book done. Well, this wasn't the first time in my life that I was bargaining with God. The other time came a couple days before my wedding. The gynecologist had called, and he probably thought I still lived in Omaha at that time, but I didn't. I was out in Holdridge. And he probably didn't know that my wedding was 3 days away, but it was. He said, I need to talk to you, and we're setting up an appointment for you. And so my bridesmaids all jump in the car with me, who are trying to help set up the wedding. We drive to Omaha, and I sit down with the gynecologist, and he goes, you'll never be able to have children. What? You have no eggs in your ovaries. What? Are you kidding me? And I did what any sane person would do. I got in the car with my bridesmaids, and I drove to Holdridge, Nebraska, and I went and I found my fiance, and I said, the wedding's off. I can't give you children. Luckily, he talked me down from the infertility cliff and got me to say I do 48 hours later. But it wasn't after telling my parents. We're like all panicked too, because I had told them before I told my fiance the wedding's off. So when I went into this moment, yeah, the wedding happened. But you know what happened right after the wedding? I got to start grieving, right? Because now I'm sitting down into that newlywed life that should be wonderful and romantic and but instead I'm processing what the gynecologist had told me 2 weeks earlier. Going back to the stages of grief, sometimes we get stuck. I got stuck when they told me you don't have any eggs in your ovaries. It's not the only time I've been stuck in the grief cycle, but definitely that one was pretty darn obvious. I was stuck in denial. I was also stuck for 20 years in denial over my miscarriage, because I finally had told my critique group that reads my writing and tells me what I need to change or just throw that story away. I had set a date. I'm going to have the Mama Where's the Baby book to you here on this date at this time. And then I set a date with my husband the night before and said, I'll have the first manuscript wrote before we go on a date. So I had to give myself deadlines to deal with that grief. And I don't know why, but I knew something was going to happen, but I didn't know what it was. And I walked out on my back porch, and I sat down with my pen and paper, and I started writing. And the tears just came, and the tears came, and the tears came. And if you look at the original manuscript I wrote, it is flooded with tear stains. I had no idea that I had been living on my positivity and denying my grief for almost 22 years. But it was in creating. This is where I think the next stage of grief starts, is in the creating. The first painful losses in my adult life was my grandma. And as a child, my grandma was the one that was there for me. When Grandpa died, she's the one that said, "I don't want to sleep alone. Will you sleep with me?" And so I slept with her that whole week when my grandpa had passed away. When I was a teenager, she's a wedding cake baker. I'd go down in her basement as she's decorating cakes, and I would spill out my whole teenage drama, and she listened to every moment of it. That was my grandma. But when she became sick, I was in New York being a nanny. And they're like, "Grandma doesn't have a lot of time left, but they are sending her home." And I flew back to take care of her that last month of her life. That was a tough loss. To be an adult and finally kind of understand the consequences that I didn't understand as a young person or even as a teenager in some of my losses. But what I found is when I grabbed Grandma's recipe and I would create her recipe, I would bake her cookies. That is when I started to feel hope. That is when I felt like my grandma could be there with me. And there were times, like when I was rocking my daughter, because eventually I did have a child, but I was rocking my daughter and with this horrible, horrible earache. And my grandma came, and it's probably my guardian angel being my, taking on the persona of my grandma, but she came and sat next to me as I'm rocking my daughter with that earache in the middle of the night as her eardrum was rupturing. God knew what I needed. He knew what was going to comfort me. But when my other grandma died, I also created her cherry mash recipe. But maybe we should always just be creating recipes, because then grief takes on a whole other thing when we've gained 100 pounds. But so what else do I create? Well, if you smelled me when I came in, hopefully you smelled me and not the Mexican I had for lunch. But I have on my mother-in-law's perfume, the lady that is in the Jack Streams of Heaven book. I wear her earrings anytime I need to be smart, because she always said, "Tammy, I'm so proud of you. The way that you've gone back from a college flunk out and made up your grades, and you're just the woman." And so I wear her earrings because this is the first day I'm giving this speech to be with me. So I create a wardrobe, her ring, right? These are the things that I bring with me because I don't want to do life without these people. I love them. And so I bring them with me. I create with them and what they've done. But there's also some pretty cool people that I've met in this journey. One of them is my friend Missy. She created Blue-eyed Dragonfly and paints pictures for people that people can send out when they've lost somebody after losing her son. My other friend has created Declan's project. She had a baby and she's watching the ultrasound and this baby's kicking and moving and whatever, and within a week the baby's just gone that she had seen. But in Declan's project, she went to a rural hospital and they medically wrapped up her baby because they didn't have a blanket small enough for a baby that size. And so now Declan's project creates and sends these baby blankets to rural hospitals. So when this happens again, that child can be held with dignity instead of with medical claws wrapped around them. These are people that I admire that have chosen to create. But did you also know that today is International Bereaved Mother's Day? Every year on the first Sunday in May, that's today. This honors mothers. I'm going to read this because it's my first time knowing about this. Honors mothers who have lost a baby or child. It's also a day to recognize women who cannot be a mother due to infertility or other health reasons. Today is about holding space for mothers whose arms ache to hold their babies, even if their baby has only lived in the dream as they dreamt of being a mother. When I was reading this and I thought, whew, this is heavy, Tammy. This is feeling heavy to me today. So I quick made up a Facebook post. I said, do you know what? People out there, if you have somebody that has had a loss, first 50 people to email me, send me their name, their address, and a message you want them to have. And I'll send them, Mama, where's the baby? Because I was feeling heavy in my grief this morning, and I'm like, I had to do something with it. And I knew I needed to do something with it. Because God made us in his image, which means we are made to create because he's a creator. This will look different for all of us. Creating the book Jack's Dreams of Heaven, obvious helped me grieve losing my mother-in-law and even my nephew. Creating Mama, Where's the Baby brought me out of that denial that I had been stuck in for 20-some years. And the loss I didn't think affected me so deeply. And it also helped me stop comparing myself to others. That was probably the big one for me too. Because I had used denial to minimize my feelings around that miscarriage. I also believe besides creating, the Lord wants us to serve. He wants us to be a service, to be a part of our grief walk, our grief journey that we're taking. Now, I know none of us signed up for that. That's what I told God when Jack's Dreams of Heaven came up, and he's like, Tammy, this is what you need to do. And I'm like, I don't want to be the grief person. I did not sign up for this, right? But it doesn't matter. We're all called to serve. And I believe that service and looking for service is saying, when we look at the fruits of the Spirit, how can we, within our grief journey, spread the fruits of the Spirit? Yes, it's to others, but I also want you to think, how can you spread those fruits of the Spirit to yourself? Because you are a child of God too. And he wants you to have and grow the fruits of the Spirit as much as he wants the next person beside you. On April 4th, 2025, I was driving back to Nebraska. My husband and I travel full-time, chasing 70 degrees. We sold or gave away everything we own about 18 months ago. But we were driving back to Nebraska because we had a baby shower to go to, and my phone rang. And it was Karen from Central City. And it's a lady I always sat by at church up there during Lent. And she was just checking in to see how we're doing. And she asked me, what book are you working on right now? Well, I was working on Lightning Bug Hunters and Firefly Chasers. But I said a book on miscarriage called Mama, Where's the Baby? And Karen goes, oh, Tammy, I lost a baby. It was back in the 1960s. Tammy, I don't know what they did with my baby. I was 7 months along. Right? Let me take a breath here. Like that was heavy. That was extremely heavy at the moment. I can't even imagine how heavy that has been for Karen, carrying that all these years. It hit hard. And I said, hey, Karen, in the book, the children make a stepping stone for their parents as a memorial to the baby. Would you like to make a stepping stone with me when I'm back in Nebraska? She goes, Tammy, you would do that for me? Yeah, I would do that for you, Karen. When I get back, we'll do that together. Well, the next day, I'm at the baby shower, and I'm telling my niece about the phone conversation with Karen. And my niece looks at me, not remembering that she had miscarried 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago. She said, Aunt Tammy, can I make a stepping stone with you? Of course, sweetheart. Of course you can. Well, my niece also runs a spa in Elkhorn, Nebraska, and there's a patio on the back of that building. And she said, do you know how many of my clients have miscarried or have lost a child? She goes, Tammy, why don't we have a stepping stone event? And I'm like, yeah, Brittany, why don't we do that? So not only was I creating and serving, now all of a sudden Brittany is creating and serving from her grief, from the miscarriage that she experienced. We still haven't done the event though, so hopefully here this summer we'll get that done. But I do want to tell you what happened with Karen. So finally in October, I made the date with Karen. I had yet to create a stepping stone or anything for the baby that I had lost 22 years prior. We met at the church where we often met to do Lent services together, and we made stepping stones to remember our babies by. Karen also then participated in the Wave of Light, an event held each October, and she named her baby. She gave her baby a name, a huge step in her healing as she went out to the Wave of Light event held at the Clark Park in Central City. And it is in the service that I believe we find the last, or not last stage, because I think grief is like this thing that we're always doing this with, right? But it's in the place that I think we find hope. I think hope is one of the stages of grief that we've ignored. And I think it comes from creating and serving. So it might be the hope of having another child after miscarriage, that you get your own rainbow baby, or a hope that there's a community that gets you, because my miscarriage was very silent. My loss of my nephew Brandon was very silent, because who was I to have grief when my sister lost her son, right? The hope that there's another part of a community that I can be a part of, and one that understands. One of the most awesome things that happened was for my husband. And the nurse had no idea she did this. But a nurse from the hospital, after we went through the miscarriage, sent us a baby ring. And my husband grabbed that ring, and he found this silver chain, and he wore that. And he wore that till that ring literally wore out and didn't take it off. Because not only do we kind of hide our grief or feel insignificant, but men sometimes feel so insignificant when it comes to miscarriage and child loss. But they're grieving too. I found it was really interesting. I was walking the beach in Texas one day, and this lady kind of beelines for me with her husband. I'm like, what the heck? Should I be scared? What should I do? And she comes up and she goes, hey, I met you the other night at trivia. Okay. And she said, I meant to ask you, what book are you working on? I'm like, well, I have several in the hopper. And I did. But anyway, the miscarriage book came up. And she shared that she was the head of flight attendants at Southwest Airlines. And she had lost a child at 9 months. And so she delivered the child. And now she tells all her regional managers, if there's any flight attendant who's lost a child, I want their name, I want their phone number. And she has made it her mission to support them and reach out to them, not only when the event happens, but she has the anniversary of all of those events on her calendar. And she continues to reach out until she feels like, okay, maybe they aren't inviting grief in anymore, and they're not probably pushing it out, right? I think you talked about it softening in the beginning. And so until that grief softens. But when we create and when we serve, I believe that is where the hope comes in the grief stages. So the day that the Lord asked me to write the book on Jack's Dreams of Heaven, he also, the book on miscarriage, he also asked me to do something else. He asked me to start a foundation called the Jackson Friends Foundation. And it's to support families who have lost a child, is one of the 3 pillars of the Jackson Friends Foundation. And what he wanted me to do, for the best I could get that day, was to ask, what did someone do for you to bring you a moment of joy or peace amongst your grief? Like for our miscarriage, the nurse sending the ring definitely was huge for us, but also my coworkers at work did a meal train for us. And they each took turns bringing meals for the next week as I recuperated. So those were huge for us. And I look at, just so many things that have happened. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand out a card. And I don't know, maybe you'll be able to do this card right now. Maybe you'll do this card later. But what I want you to do is, and I don't know what your loss is, right, of why you're here today, if it's around a child or not. But I know that I've said a whole lot of stupid things to grieving people. And I would love information to share with people of what did bring healing to somebody. What did bring that moment of joy or peace that somebody did for you? So if you're willing to share, let me go back to the next slide. If you're willing to share the context of like, I lost my son, or I lost my husband, or I found out that my baby was gone. So I kind of know where you're starting from. And then what did someone do? Did your best friend take the keys to your house that had them and go in and clean it so it was ready for you when you got home and to accept visitors if you had that type of situation? Because this is what had happened to somebody that I love and care about. They had called their best friend from the hospital and said, he's gone. And the best friend took her spare key and went, knowing that she's going to have, you know your friends, if they have the whole dirty dishes in the sink and all that, and she knew that was going to happen. And so she went over and she cleaned her house before she could even get home. So she didn't have to worry about people coming over to see them and seeing the dirty dishes and things like that. So if you're willing to share that, I would appreciate it. And then if you're willing to put your contact information, so if you're willing to make a video or an audio recording of this, once we get to that point, this is a pretty new to me, okay? The Jackson Friends Foundation is only a few months old. It just got approved by the IRS at the end of last year. But I want to be able to share. And I understand that you might be scared of leaving somebody out. But what if I tell you this, but man, if I say my sister did this, but then my other sister, what will she think? That's okay. Like, if you don't want us to use your name, if you don't want to do the video for us, that's okay too. But I do think there are things that have been done for you because the Lord sends us people in our lives to spread the fruits of the Spirit. And so what are those things? So if you're willing to share that, please do that on that card. In community, I believe, is how we find hope ourselves. It's not sitting at home by ourselves. It's not my husband sitting at home recuperating from heart surgery right now by himself. I don't think it's a good idea to always guess what God's up to or what his intentions are, but yet I do it all the time. And I do think God wants us to spread that peace and that joy in the world among other fruits of the Spirit. Because, again, we're grieving, yet he's teaching us how to support other grieving people. Okay? One of the dreams that I had, or visions, was I was doing a meditation and I had met my guardian angel in this visitation. And there's this big path behind her, but she's holding her hand out like this, and she has a heart in her hand. And I step forward to the guardian angel, and she moves out of the way, and I still can't quite see what's behind her. I just know it's a beautiful path and these mountains and things like that. And there's this heart, and all of a sudden I'm like, why is there a heart? Tell me why there's a heart. And then in steps Jesus. And he goes, Tammy, just show him my heart. Just show him my heart. And so I think maybe that's why you're here today too. Is because we're all here to say, I want to show you Jesus' heart. And when you read Mama, Where's the Baby, you'll notice one of the key things is they say, I should just skip the book because I'm going to mess it up. But anyway, it's Mama is our baby with Jesus. And so the little girl says, Mama, where's the baby? Katie was confused. The baby has gone to heaven, Dad answered. How? Matthew asked. Mom opened the book, showed him the baby. I'll skip over that part. And then the girl in the book says, Katie wondered, is Jesus taking care of our baby? Yes, Mama replied. Jesus has our baby until we get to heaven. Because the thing that brought me a huge amount of joy and peace, and probably more so peace, but eventually joy, was when the office manager at our office, that was part of the food train, found out that my other boss had said, by the way, something happened last week and we are not talking about it, when I got back to work. He was very uncomfortable with grief. She marched down to my office and she had this picture, and it was a picture of Jesus holding a baby. And she goes, Tammy, he's got your baby till you get there. The Lord planted that seed in my heart 22 years ago through her after somebody had said something really rude. Right? And that's why I think your story is so important. But the other thing I like you to write on the other part of your card, if you could, is what is something you have done yourself to discover hope? Maybe it was through creating and serving, like my theory is. But what has brought you a moment of joy or peace amongst your grief? What have you created or discovered? What have you created or served to discover hope? Like teaching my grandchildren grandma's recipes has given me hope, right? That legacy living. And even though we can sit here today and think about, man, what's my plan to serve or create? Which I hope you do, because I think you'll find that within you and you'll attract that into your life. But sometimes it's not always about God's timing. Sometimes it is about His timing, because He wants others to know they are not to grieve alone. And so when I wrote Jack's Dreams of Heaven, I guess I don't know who it was for besides me, but the key to unlock my childhood best friend's heart came through Jack's Dreams of Heaven. Because little did I know, her mom, Jo, was going to pass away. And that fall, her sisters, then her dad passed away, not long after that. And they were healthy, like great people. Like none of this was predicted. And when Deanna and her sisters all got home after the funeral, they had pre-ordered Jack's Dreams of Heaven, not because they knew what it was about, because their little neighborhood girl wrote a book. But God had planted that community. Because now not only were they creating a community as they read this book to their own grandchildren about where did grandma go, on top of that, all the sisters were like, did you get the book? Did you get the book? Oh my gosh, did you bawl? You read it? I was bawling. I couldn't. Like the amount of community that kept creating had been planted months and months ahead, knowing that the Lord knowing that they're going to need that community. So each of you, again, has a card, but we also have seashells. And in the book, the children make a stepping stone and use seashells from their beach vacation. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do, if you're willing to, is spread fruits of the Spirit by grabbing some seashells. And I have all kinds of markers up here, thin ones, thick ones, Sharpie ones, all of that. And I'm going to ask you to write messages inside of seashells. And if you guys have ever seen the kindness rocks, and that people are like putting them all over, I know Clark's library has a bunch. But what if you wrote messages in these seashells and either had them ready to give to people when the Lord introduces you to that person, or you just start going and randomly putting them in different flower beds this spring so you can spread the fruits of the Spirit. So I'm going to ask y'all to come up, grab us some seashells. I have these envelopes that you can put your seashells in and take them home. But let's go ahead and spend some time spreading the fruits of the Spirit by making the seashells. With how long does a feeling last? And we know that feelings, like the research showed, is the 90 seconds to 5 minutes. So there's two things here. Number one, there is going to be joy and peace at some point, right? That comes into our life. And so it's about sitting in that moment, right? Sitting in that moment and realizing you only get 90 seconds to have that and not picking up the phone to take a picture of it, right? There are things I do think you should take pictures of, but if you only have 90 seconds to experience that feeling, make sure you sit with it. The other part about that is with the tears, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, and it's like when the tears come, yes, the grief is going to go on, but that part of the grief right there is only probably going to last 90 seconds to 5 minutes. Just like when I sat and I was writing my story and the tears were coming and coming and coming. And I just gave them permission to flow because I knew in about 5 minutes the tears were going to dry up. So instead of resisting that, I let it go. So if I have that opportunity to help somebody experience the joy in a moment or the sadness or whatever they're experiencing, I try to let that happen. I try to let that happen. So let's not set a clock on everything and think that we have to be healed by this time. We have to be moved on this time. But realize that we're on a walk and we're on a journey with the grief because we loved. And I keep trying to remind myself that because I loved. Because I loved. I'm going to choose grief. Sometimes I'm going to need to push it out just to survive. Other times I'm going to invite it in because I'm finally ready. But it's there. So thank you. If you guys want to take over on the discussion.